We're ready to have a conversation that's been titled Building the Most Accessible Orchestra on the Planet. So please join me in welcoming to stage Paul Hogle from the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, Clark Durant from the Cornerstone Charter School and the New Common School Foundation, Chacona Winters-Johnson, and Jim Rose. Please join me in giving them a good welcome. Much better. Come on. Come on. Hey, please.
Hello? No. Hello? Just hit the green button. Perfect. Some of you look a little puzzled by my appearance. How many of you were here 2 years ago for my SphinxCon remarks? Raise your hand. So maybe this will help you understand my presentation a little better. Thank you for inviting me today. Wait, who was here for last year's, 2 years ago, SphinxCon? I delivered a speech about the audition process of the American Orchestra entirely behind a curtain. It was incredible because I knew every word I was going to say. You've ruined a perfectly good linen napkin. What's that? That's a bad sign when that goes down. What? Don't worry, I'm a professional. Thank you very much for being here today. It's really my pleasure to be back here at SphinxCon, and I'm honored to have been asked. I'm also honored to be joined by what I think is the all-star panel, although it's hard to follow a pastor, a politician, and an older man. But I think we have an all-star panel. I'm flattered by your attendance. I know Friday afternoon, conference, lots going on in a busy life. So thank you very much for being here. I have a threefold goal for my 10 minutes, 3 things to accomplish. First thing I want to do is I want to explore with you some of the artifacts, big fancy word, that you think make something accessible. So that'll be point 1. Number 2, I want to answer the question that if the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, as it claims to be, is the most accessible orchestra on the planet, how do we know? And then third thing is that my dear friend Jamie is going to nurture a group discussion that will take us from the points I make into an application phase, and really where Alpha left off, what would you take back to your place of work or worship or community and use as an application? That's for me. So the first part, point 1, this is audience participation. I'm just going to ask you to shout it out, and I will repeat it for the television so you can see it. The question is, what do you think is an artifact of accessibility? Is Eric Booth here, by the way? No. He's very good at defining words. Artifact is something that represents something for today's purposes. Yes, sir. Diverse patrons. Diverse patrons, an excellent answer. I'm going to make up names for him. I'm going to call you Jim. Victor. No problem. Victor. That's a very good, thank you. Oliver, do you have one? No. 4 o'clock this session started. Artifacts, yes, Bob. Nope, made that name up, come on. Social media presence, a well-developed, so not just putting anything up there, but actually a well-thought-through. That's a great one, very nice. How about this side of the room, way over here? I'm just pointing randomly because no one's putting up their hand. Susan. Yeah, Bill. Relevance, an artifact of accessibility. One more from this side of the room. Karen. Diane. Audience or artist? Audience participation. That's a great one. So there are 4 things for you to think. Oh, yes, Dion. Amanda. That's the next one. Bilingual programming. That's a great one for accessibility. See, so if we sat here for another 5 minutes, we'd come up with dozens and dozens of artifacts of accessibility. I use those to reference my points I'm going to make about the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. What is the one word that you think comes out in every patron survey when they're asked to describe their city's orchestra? Excellence? What else? World class. The world class institution. See, I listened to the last panel. Well, shockingly, maybe not, the number one of three things that comes out in every survey of patrons is, this is more dramatic when it works, expensive. Every single time, expensive. That leads me to my description of what I think are 4 artifacts of accessibility. These aren't exhaustive. They're not intended to be. They're just 4 channels for you to think about. My first artifact is the economic dimension. In most cases, I find this to be a false barrier. I say this because professional sports stadiums overflow with fans buying excruciatingly high-priced tickets to watch mostly average teams lose half of their games. You know it's true. And of course, many patrons will pay more for an Adele or a Taylor Swift or a Calvin Harris. I had to look all 3 of those up. I had no idea who they were. It's not true. They'd pay more for an Adele, Taylor Swift, or Calvin Harris ticket than the cost of their monthly electric bill. Nevertheless, when we ask patrons and the average Joe and Jane in our community, think about free association when it comes to your city's orchestra, one of the words they always come up with is that it's expensive. Artifact number 2, the programming. I'm not using the artifact of programming as a synonym for top 40 repertoire. In fact, I think Bates and Higden and Theophanides are just as accessible as Beethoven, Haydn, and Tchaikovsky. Accessibility, through my eyes, is in the delivery. When asked, the same patrons, what things help you access a new composition, for example, the answers are not surprising. They talk about coherent program notes. They talk about being able to be up close and personal with the composer in real time. Concert talks, listening to their thought process about why they created that piece of art. And they also talked about conductors breaking down the wall between the stage and the audience and speaking about the piece they're about to hear, sometimes even playing excerpts. Just one example. I realize that there are a litany of considerations when it comes to programming as a point of accessibility. And I've just picked this one little dimension of how you might consider access to new music, and it comes to their experiences. My third artifact is being literally and virtually convenient. This covers the waterfront from concert locations to digital access. I'll go into a little bit more detail in my next section, but suffice it to say, physical and digital availability are important aspects of accessibility. Finally, we get to the elephant in the room. It's the reality that in cities across North America, thousands of predominantly white fans come out week after week to watch almost exclusively white professionals skate through some of the most complicated passages as the fans sit patiently by, occasionally jumping to their feet with applause, only to then run to the bars and to the restrooms at the break, then return to their seats and dutifully wait for the next appropriate time to erupt in applause and jump to their feet again. But enough about the National Hockey League.
Oh, come on, he earned that. Come on.
Come on. Have you been to a hockey game recently? In all seriousness, that was such a great build-up. I waited weeks to deliver that. In all seriousness, the final artifact of an institution of accessibility is one that represents, embraces, reflects and engages with the diversity and all its complex implications of the community which it serves. While there are many more artifacts of accessibility, this afternoon I have chosen these four for our consideration. Those are economic, programming, convenience, and diversity. So my second point, if the DSO is the universe's most accessible orchestra, how do we know? And I'm going to point out a few things. You can then determine, and then we'll have a discussion. The first is the economic response. In 2011, the DSO fundamentally rethought its business model and came to grips with the cold, hard truth that the DSO could not sell its way to prosperity. This then liberated us to embrace four other beliefs. The first belief, audience is our economic engine. Number two, contributed revenue is in fact our primary revenue. Number three, audience size is more important than ticket revenue. And number four, the DSO must position itself as a cause, not a product. This line of thinking unleashed a tidal wave of economic accessibility. Patron-minded pricing, where freakishly low prices were unleashed on all of our concerts. Half of our concerts are $25 or less in the hall, and the average ticket price is actually lower than it was in 1999. A program called Sound Card, invented by Leonard Slatkin, our music director. For $25, a student can go to every concert of the DSO all year long. Our 3711 program, Young Professionals, if you're 37 years old or less, you pay $11 for a ticket. Detroit Rush, if you live in a Detroit zip code, $15 a ticket. That was sponsored by the Ford Foundation, by the way. Our student training programs, which have some 400 to 600 children involved, cost about $10 a week, with scholarships coming to a strong, substantial portion of our students participating. Free webcasts and radio broadcasts listened in audiences around the world. Of course, our annual week of free concerts where we go into communities sponsored by DTE Energy, and they help pick the communities we go to based on them nominating themselves in a partnership. And the final one, which I find a little amusing, is our parking and concessions, just to take this to an extreme. Parking, if you're a subscriber, $5. Can't park anywhere for $5. Concessions, you can buy a very nice drink for $2 or $3. I realize that there are many other dimensions to this accessibility of economics, but right now I wanted to use those as an example. Programming, point two. The DSO has tremendous number of Detroit, American, and world premieres. It's standard operating procedure for the program notes to be written as I described, very accessibly and straightforward. We have a high preference for living composers to be present so they can engage in the community and local universities and patron centers. We often deploy them in a series of fairly unconventional radio interviews and appearances so they can be involved in the community. And they're almost always involved in our pre-concert chats. And the music director is always asked to do an explanation as he walks through their work, often interviewing them when they're talking about it. That's the way we would approach programming. Convenience. The DSO's third response is convenience. In 2011, we moved 1/3 of our programs outside of Orchestra Hall into 7 different neighborhoods and created the Neighborhood Residency Initiative. Substantial investment in location, accessibility, helped us to serve these neighborhoods as if it was headquartered in their own community. Each community has a 4-concert subscription series with engagement from the musicians, schools, community, centers, retirement communities, places of worship. At the same time, we've built an international web audience that now exceeds 1 million viewers. These live concerts are free, and all of the programs are available for replay afterwards. Finally, in this edition, we also created something called Classroom Edition, which is an educational webcast designed around the national music standards and delivered into classrooms twice a year. Finally, my last point is diversity. And these 3 sections are some statistics, the result of our work together. We have 88 members of our board, You can read the statistics about male, female, 14% African American, 3% Asian, 2% Arab American, 1% Hispanic. 30% identify themselves with one or more ethnic group. I realize there's much more to the diversity conversation than just these, but these are some that were used in a recent Ford Foundation grant. Of our 71 full-time staff members, 42% male, 58% female, 31% from their representation of underrepresented ethnic groups, and 20 members of our management team come from that. On our orchestra, perhaps the hardest to get over, a third are female, 2.5% African American, 1.3% Latino or Latina. And I would tell you that at our last audition for the last year, we had 800 people come to Detroit for auditions. For 7 different auditions, 35 were African Americans, 30 were Latino, 3 Black and 1 Latino advanced out of the first round, which is a high bar to get over, and we hired our first Latino member of the orchestra last year. So that's a nice progress. That really leads to the question that Jamie's going to facilitate. Given the pursuit of accessibility, and what I told you were the ways we approached it, how might this panel interact with us on how to apply it into your work? So I turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul. Please thank Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
So one of the things that I like so much about this panel is that we really have a sort of opportunity to do a Rashomon move here because we have 4 very different points of view, right? We've heard from the sort of administration side. We have a community partner. We have someone who can speak as a board member. We have someone who can speak as a musician. So I think before we get into the how do we transfer these lessons, what do we take home, let's actually begin by questioning the assumption we're beginning with. Is DSO the most accessible orchestra on the planet, from a musician's point of view?
Well, first I got to say that, Paul, what an outstanding job you all have done in these last 5 years. We met in 2011, and what an outstanding job. So the board and the management of the Detroit Symphony should be congratulated for making all the moves that they've made. Yet at the same time, when you go to the Detroit Symphony, you see a predominantly majority symphony orchestra, and that's reality. And in particular for young people who are coming to view the orchestra, to look at it as a potential profession, to see themselves having this be an opportunity for them to earn livings for their families, again, it still appears that there are difficulties and barriers to that entry point. So I think along the way, the answer to that is great progress being made. Yet at the same time, greater progress needs to be made. Even the NFL has made, and we're in football weekend here now. We always have to talk a little bit about football, but I think football in the positive sense bespeaks itself now with the Roney rule. And the Roney rule says that for any executive position in a major football franchise, it has to interview African American and diverse candidates. And I think the American Symphony Orchestra League might want to take a bold move to infuse that kind of rule into the hiring practices in orchestra, because reality is, and we have a lot of more mature people here in the room, is that until that power structure begins to shift, then it still remains, if you will, more of a closed and exclusive environment rather than the necessary, open, and inclusive environment that the music world will need going forward in the future if it's to continue.
There's a really amazing group called Policy Link that works nationally on issues of equity. And the 3 questions that they bring to any topic is who pays, who benefits, and who decides. As a board member, how are we doing at the DSO on the who decides dimension? How are the power structures, how is the decision coming along? Are we approaching accessibility?
Absolutely. We spend a lot of time on the board talking about accessibility. The management has really taken that and taken it to heart, and we work hard at it. Board meetings are no longer you sit around the board and you just, put a rubber stamp on what they bring to you. We break out in groups. We talk about really the diversity. Look at the board. Look at who are officers on the board. I think if you look in the last several years, the vice chairs have been far more diverse than they've been in a long time. The people who come and are involved in committees are more diverse, and we're working very hard. But as has been said, you never can stop at this. You must constantly continue. We also have to be diverse in age. And so this work really begins at an early age, bringing people in at all levels so that they're prepared to become on the board. And I think the DSO has done a very good job at that, but I never take for granted that, oh, we've got this title as being the most accessible orchestra. That doesn't mean anything. We must keep working at it. We must keep working at it because it's the right thing to do. And ultimately, it's for the benefit of the orchestra, the organization, and for our great city. Because don't we want citizens, all of our citizens, to have and understand our cultural organizations? And they need to know that the board, we're thinking about all those items.
That's great. Clark, you're a community partner to the DSO. Partnership implies a joining of two equals. How have you found partnering with the DSO? Is it accessible? Is it a marriage of equals? Is it someone showing up in an ocean liner and telling you, we're here to deliver what's good for you? Aren't you lucky to receive it?
Well, let me put this in context.
Yeah.
When our Cornerstone schools first opened 25 years ago, we knew that music was important to the education of the children. And so the board and others made a pledge to each other that we would make it possible for every third grader to get a violin and to begin that process of, learning how to use it, how to listen to it, to all the technical aspects, but even the discipline and the character attributes that go into trying to be good at something like a violin. And I can say categorically that being able to have the DSO as a partner in different kinds of ways where different musicians have come in without fanfare, just quietly to work with some of our kids or do other things has been fabulous. I always tease the DSO that this ought to be at schools everywhere across the city. I think one of the things that often gets left out about any question of accessibility is what is the moral purpose of music? And we talk oftentimes about the externalities. Can you webcast this? Can you do this? What's the ticket pricing, whatever. I don't think we spend enough time talking about the moral function of music in the shaping of a character of a person and of a community.
That's great. I'm going to ask Jim and Paul a question, and then I'm going to open this up because this is really a conversation I want to get you guys all involved with. Jim, you invoked the Rooney Rule, right? We need to take into account that we are having a diverse application pool.
Sure.
Paul, you demonstrated the way we have auditions for musicians. Totally blind, you can't take anything about who they are as a person into account. We just applauded that the DSO hired its first Latino musician. In how many years has the symphony been around?
123.
Right. So how do we reconcile these things? How do we reconcile how many years of blind auditions? How do we reconcile that we actually hold a diverse and representative body of artists as a value, and yet we can't achieve that? So can the two of you sort of begin to unpack that as you guys think through what questions this or other things raise for you, and we'll come to these two mics or raise a hand.
I'll give you a stark answer. The reason that I keep saying that we're the most accessible orchestra on the planet is not a bragging pitch line. It's actually a reminder of a saying that someone told me once, that every system perfectly produces the outcome for which it was calibrated. Every system perfectly creates the outcome for which it was calibrated. By us saying that over and over and over again, we have to figure out how to achieve it. We have to calibrate our system to it. I went to one of the graduations of one of this country's premier conservatories in the past year. Sat through graduation, and I'm sure my memory's a little wrong. I'm old. I'm not a preacher or a politician, though. I don't think a single person of color graduated from that conservatory that year, or at least they didn't walk across the stage. So from the DSO's point of view, my personal agenda is to get more involved in the pipeline. The way to address what happens on stage is, in one of the ways, it's not there's no monolithic answer, is it's a pipeline issue. You can't have the elite training programs of our country not doubling down on finding, identifying, nurturing, and advancing this talent. So, Jim?
So just before you do, I worked at the New York Philharmonic 20 years ago, and it was a pipeline problem 20 years ago.
Yeah, sure.
So 20 years is a generation.
Yep.
Right, so it's a pipeline problem, right? Another 20 years and we've got it.
So you were there when my friend Jerome Ashby.
Yes, yeah. So I was under Deborah Bord and Kurt Mazur days.
Of course.
Yes, yes.
Of course. So I'd first like to say that this is a conversation. And I'm sitting here as a guest. And I certainly would like to hear what others have to say on this subject. It's a difficult subject. It's one subject here in this community that I would call almost intractable, given the length of time that has occurred and gone on. I think there is time now and room for change. I understand the validity of the blind audition. I've been in them. I know what it's like, and I understand the importance of that tradition and hiring practice. Yet at the same time, this visual depiction of what is occurring in our orchestras has to change. And I think there's an opportunity, and I heard it from the last speakers, that I think there's an opportunity for a certain level of partnership and agreement that will allow a organization, a funding organization, and a performing organization to get together and continue to expand the number of fellowships where African American, Latinos, and others can be placed into orchestras for reasonable periods of time, so that if they're of that standard, of course, that they can have the opportunity to work for 2 or 3 years and really begin to understand the rigor of the professional symphony orchestra and have the day-by-day mentorship that needs to go on in order to transition this issue that has existed in the symphony orchestra community in America and the world for over 128 years.
That's right. Yeah, let's go to Clark, and then we're going to come out here because someone in the audience has something to say about this.
Sure.
So, great. We'll come right to you, Clark.
Very quickly, it's interesting that Jim is touching on this. Jim and I are involved together in a totally unmusical partnership that is based on this same premise of early access. We formed a partnership with Deloitte, where Jim works, to begin the development of professional services for our students starting in the 5th grade. So because the professional services firms had identified the same problem that's being talked about here, Jim and others came and said, can we start a pilot where we begin to equip young people with highly disciplined, highly focused professional services preparation and start in the 5th grade. So we started with our 9th graders, and we're doing our high school, and we're working backwards. We're working on the curriculum now, but I think the same thing is true about the music piece too.
That's great. Sir, right here. Would you mind going to the mic? Thanks. And to join the conversation, just say a word about who you are of introduction.
My name is Walter Bittner. I'm the Director of Education and Community Engagement at the Nashville Symphony.
Great.
And this topic is, I'm a little anxious to be one of the first people to talk here, but it's a topic very dear to our hearts and the whole reason I'm here at this conference. We've just started an initiative called the Rondo program, which is a program for students in grades 5th through 12th grade from unrepresented communities in American orchestras to assist them with the instructional opportunities to prepare them to win auditions at conservatories and music schools. And I'm a former private and public school music educator. Spent 25 years teaching instrumental and vocal music. So my whole perspective is very much with what Paul was saying. It's a pipeline issue. There are not enough people from the underrepresented communities making their way into music school and conservatories to be eligible to enter into the audition process, which is not to say that we shouldn't have the fellowship programs that we have, and those shouldn't be strengthened and looked at very carefully, but I think like every step of the process should be looked at. But in general, there is not enough being done in our schools, and especially in elementary school, when children are most able to quickly develop musical aptitude. There's not enough being done to prepare students who might wish to pursue musical careers to give them what they need to do it at that age. You can't wait until you're in high school to begin to learn how to play your instrument if you want to become a professional.
Very rare.
So so it's not really a question, it's more just a statement, and to urge anybody going back to their own community to look at your community closely and see if there are ways that you can improve the efforts to open the minds of people in the African American and Latino communities to consider classical arts as a viable career.
So let me just take that as a jumping off point and turn it into a question. Is it too easy to say that this is all an arts education problem? That all we need to do is get more arts education in the schools, we need to expose more young people to it, and 200 years of exclusion will fall away? Or is there something else that we actually need to push through? Are we letting ourselves off the hook?
Yes, I mean, I don't argue with the point that we need to put more in arts education. I think everyone in this room is all for that.
Is anyone against arts ed?
That's on the 5th floor.
But there are talented musicians there, and I think we have to be very honest and give ourselves a deep dive in looking at alternatives and exploring them and knowing that it's not, the talent exists, it's where do you find it and how do you nurture it, and networking. It is this happens in education, higher education that I've been a part of. It is just too easy to say the problem exists somewhere else. What do we do meanwhile? Are we waiting 20 years, 15 years before orchestras are more diverse? I mean, Sphinx is doing something about that in a sense, but I think we all have to take it on, and this is not my world in terms of a profession, so I can't come up with all the solutions, but I request that we constantly think about that and we find ways to do that. So I'm very interested in other comments of how that could be addressed here.
Clark, jump in.
I
and
think
then Jim.
I think the gentleman raises a very good point. A lot of people don't believe, honestly, that you can have a viable financial career, let alone a satisfying professional career, unless you do hard rock or all the, that sort of music, as opposed to within the classical tradition of a symphony or whatever, that there just isn't a viable lifestyle economic path. I mean, from some of the surveys, even conversations we do with some of our own students. So I don't think there's enough understanding of the full life that's possible going down a professional musician as opposed to just the commercial rock star sort of stuff.
Excellent. Did you want to say anything else?
Yeah, I forgot to say the name of our program is called Cello Rondo, and I'd be thrilled to talk to anybody about it while we're here.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thank you so much. Just say a word to introduce yourself and join the conversation.
Thank you. I'm Charles Dickerson. I'm the founder, executive director, and conductor of the Inner City Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles. Several points. I congratulate Detroit for what you're doing, but I want to give you a challenge. If we wait till 5th grade, it's too late. The young people who are winning auditions start when they're 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. That's before 3rd grade. If we just wait for the schools to fund these projects, that ain't going to happen.
It'll be a long way.
Economics of our country today just don't allow for that to happen. So I bring a challenge to every single symphony orchestra in this country to go into the inner city communities of this country, like the inner city of Detroit, and start a youth orchestra.
Yep.
And it doesn't have to be, and it should not be, I should say, the typical kind of youth orchestra that we see from so many youth orchestras, in so many programs, where what we do is we have competitive seating, competitive auditions, but rather we take in young people who, frankly, at the stage of life that I'm talking about, starting with 5, 6, 7 years old, know nothing about
We
a
teach them
competition.
that. Right.
and you bring them in and you teach them.
Yeah.
And if this happened in Detroit, if this happened in every single city where there is an NFL or a Major League Baseball or an NBA town, you'd all of a sudden find at least 30 programs around the country that the Detroit Symphony and other symphonies could take pride in, saying, we are training these young people. It has nothing to do with the school system, has nothing to do with anything else. We're taking this upon themselves. Now, there's going to be a question of funding. We can have that conversation later, but I challenge every single orchestra in this country to start an orchestra in the basement of the local AME church, the local Baptist church, and you wouldn't believe how many kids you'd get coming to your program, how many parents you would say, can my child? And how many pastors would say, would you start one in my church?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think it's a really great idea.
Very good idea.
Let me come over to this microphone. Please introduce yourself.
I think the DSO ought to pay for that plane ticket.
Good afternoon. My name is Derek Reeves. I am the principal violist of the Fort Wayne Philharmonic Orchestra, and I was also the DSO fellow from 1997 to 1999.
Bravo.
And I'm also here as the principal second violinist of the Sphinx Symphony Orchestra. And I have a deep and abiding love for the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, partially because of the insight that I gleaned during my time as a fellow, and a deep and abiding hatred of the audition process, just because of what a miserable experience it is. And all of my colleagues that are professional musicians will be able to vouch for just how nerve-wracking it is. On a level, I think we all recognize that it is a very unbiased and fair way of, and I say fair in quotation marks, fair way of hiring. But at the same time, there's so many issues besides just artistic capability or talent or whatever you want, musical talent, whatever you want to call it. Because when you get into a situation like that where you're behind the curtain, playing isolated excerpts from the repertoire with spaces without any sort of, in the absence of any sort of musical context. You've got issues of, being able to regulate your own respiratory, being able to calm your heart rate, being able to calm the fight or flight impulse. And that is a skill that, that I learned, just by taking numerous auditions, but also in the audition preparation that was part of the fellowship that I was privileged to win with Detroit. But I would suggest, just like the gentleman before me suggested, that with youth orchestras, that not only this competitiveness, which to so many of us seems that it's sort of mutually exclusive from the artistic impulse, the idea that we need to compete, even though that is very much part of the fabric that should be taught as part of the youth symphony experience. The study of excerpts should be something that's incorporated very early into musical education. The study of for string players, the studies of different styles of bowing, different types of articulation, because the orchestral style of playing is dramatically different from the solo style of playing that is emphasized in so many modern schools of music. And so I would suggest that the approach in changing the conversation and the approach to music education, really, if the audition process is going to continue to be part of the hiring process as it is now, and seems like it will be for the foreseeable future, then that really needs to be incorporated into the approach and the development of young artists from a much younger age. I personally started playing the violin when I was 2.5 years old, but playing an orchestral audition is harder than playing an entire concerto with an orchestra. It's much more difficult, and it takes a much higher level of control.
That's great. Thank you very much. Let's go over here.
My name is Raymond Boucher. I'm Director of Marketing and PR for Naxos Records, and I'm loving this panel. You talked about the pipeline when you worked at the New York Philharmonic, which brought to my mind, not all the pipelines for people of color are broken. if you go to, I live half-time in New York and half-time in Toronto. If I go to the major music schools there, obviously the Asian pipeline seems to be working fantastically well, and that's showing up in the orchestras. And also, things like El Sistema are sending fantastic graduates all over the world. My question to the panel is, why are those pipelines working? And what can we all look at to make other pipelines work just as well?
All right, excellent. Jim.
Well, thank you very much for your comment and your question. You might want to stand near the mic because follow up. So when you look at those pipelines, what do you understand about why those pipelines work well?
I think, frankly, economics has something to do with it. In the case of El Sistema, it has been, for whatever reason, that was designed as a social program, first of all.
Right.
And it was acknowledged and supported hugely by the government of Venezuela as a social program. So the infrastructure was there. In the case of the Asian pipeline, it's a more complicated answer, I think. I mean, obviously, I have no firsthand personal experience living in the Asian pipeline. However, there was also a perception at certain points in Asian history, particularly recent Chinese history, where the study of classical music was viewed as something highly, highly desirable, and for which families would basically mortgage just about anything to get their kids that. Given sheer numbers, that's produced an enormous number of extraordinarily capable musicians.
Thank you. So I'll sort of respond from African American perspective and perhaps add to a little bit of the Latino, and I'd like to hear from others. There is a long-term systemic problem in this country having to do with the disparagement of the African American. I'm actually, by the way, one of the firsts. I'm the first African American partner in Deloitte in Detroit. So the first, 136 years, the first. And so the reason why I framed my comment in this way is because unless the leadership of the organizations, the philanthropy of these organizations, and the large philanthropic organizations, look at this issue and say, this issue now is clear and distinctly exposed. If it is clear and distinctly exposed, those organizations have to become accountable for that. And once that accountability is in place, and exposure and accountability is in place, then I think we can start to do something about it. As long as we take a look at it and, yeah, it's a pipeline problem, and no, it's our pipeline problem. Our nation is changing in its demographic. Mm-hmm. And it's not changing to Asian American, it's changing to Hispanic American, it's changing and blending into African American, et cetera. And so our organizations have, the organizations of power have to say, this is important for our nation. In Cleveland, I love Cleveland.
I'm from Cleveland.
There you go.
All right.
And in Cleveland, the Cleveland Art Museum, there's a fabulous history of where, and many people know that it was built and designed by those wealthy individuals for the people. And this is a new thought that I think needs to be infused into the institution and the organizations that, see this as an issue, loud and clear, and are willing to take bold steps and be accountable for changing it. And that's what leadership is, in my mind.
That goes back exactly to the point Paul made. Systems work the way they're designed to, right? I'm going to take moderator's prerogative. May I ask for 10 more minutes on that clock? I think this question is, give me 10. This is a big question.
And bring in dinner
All
for
right.
everyone.
We're going to move through really quickly. I want to get a lot of voices. We've got 10 minutes. Really, at 10 minutes, we're coming down because otherwise they pull my plug. So we're going to go to Desi over here. We're going to come over here. And then we're going to have closing comments from here. And we'll try and do it in 5.
Just some takeaways with being involved in a music program. It's not a classical music program, it's a jazz program. But I think one of the things that we can do is you go into the programs that are already working. It's about the boots on the ground. And I'm not saying ours, but keeping your ear to the ground to see who in high school has the program that is really working. Go to that teacher. It's about relationship, or the person or that program, and say, what can we do? Because this is what we are trying to do eventually. What can we do, or what do you think can be done to strengthen what you're doing, and then trickling it down so that it reaches a younger age progressively and continues to go top. To use the motto of my partner, Jamal Dickerson, they call him, because he does jazz, they call him from Oberlin every year. So now to see, who do you have? What students do you have? Right. And now, so if that happens, and say if it was classical music, and Oberlin, let's say Oberlin was one of the feeder schools, because we all have from feeder schools for the orchestra, now you're more aligned. He has the thing called vertical articulation, where they teach him on an elementary school level, then they pass him off to the guy on the middle school level, then they pass him off to him on the high school level, and then we're passing them to the Berkeleys, and we're passing them to the Oberlins. So the thing is, the people, you go to the people who's ever in Detroit that it's working. So what can we do? What do you need to help strengthen this program? And it's the same thing. It's like going to the people. Same thing that we talked about in the last session. We're just modeling it again. And we may not fix it right now, but I think it's just a stab at fixing it eventually, just chipping away at it. So going, again, just to summarize it, because I am in theater and I can go on. We go to the programs that are already working and say, this is what we need. We want to see more diversity. What can we do to strengthen what you do so that eventually you affect that program?
That's great.
And then they can build throughout. And what's going to happen, and I am going to sit down because we're going to share. We are going to share.
Excellent.
It's going to become, that program becomes a magnet. It's like everything else in the hood, for lack of a better term. And I love that term anyway. I'm not even going to say that. People flock to the program. And it grows because it's there.
That's excellent. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Vicki Fernandez from the Rutgers University new program for diverse executive leaders in the arts. One of the things I was not really surprised at, but I guess also surprised at, talking about the diversity of the artists in the orchestra, but then looking at the diversity of the staff of the orchestra themselves. And that's one of the things that we're identifying as one of the issues for diversity and accessibility and inclusion in the arts, is the lack of diversity and accessibility and inclusion for executives and administrators. So I was wondering if you can speak to that point a little bit and talk about maybe some of the solutions or the ideas that you have among those topics.
Excellent. So I'm going to use that as a jumping off point. We're going to take the last 5 minutes. I'd love everyone to sort of send us home with a closing thought. Reflect on leadership, reflect on the who decides question, reflect on the pipeline, reflect on the structural, reflect on the systemic. And I'm going to start with Jim. We're going to come down. And while I'm giving them a moment to think, who here has heard the Detroit Symphony perform? Excellent. Who has not? These are the people to talk to after. Perfect. All right, excellent. Jim, what do you want folks to go home with? What should they wake up tomorrow do different? What should they know that they didn't know before?
Great question. And it's a great question about something I'm very, very, very passionate about. And I'm passionate about it because of Sphinx, to be honest with you, because I didn't believe that we'd ever have this kind of conversation in my lifetime. So to Afa and Aaron, thank you for your leadership in putting this together. Unbelievable. And since I know them both very well for the entire time that the program's been in place, and I've been honored to play here with them, I would say that it's the same as what it took to build this organization. It took a bold vision to do something that had never been done before. And I think a bold vision needs to be in place with all of the leaders and presidents of the orchestras in this country and opera organizations in this country to really take this issue and deal with it and not pass it off to the foundations, not pass it off to the pipeline. This is our organization right now. We have an opening on this position. How many African American Latino candidates can we find and invite to this position and jump on this each and every time? And I think that's the charge that I have. That's the bold approach. Stop passing it off, own it.
Just do it. Excellent. Chacona?
Well, I have to agree with you. I think it is so important to own it, and it's at all levels. The last question was about the administration and the staff and how diverse that is, and of course, how diverse is the board. So it has to reflect the communities, really has to affect the communities. I think the disadvantage in our cultural organizations, it is not like other organizations that have to answer to the public more. I mean, you look at governments and you look at where we vote, and people are more representative of their community, but this is a selection to be involved in cultural organizations. But we that are involved in those cultural organizations must say back, how is our community? We must reflect that. And it's for the musicians, it's for the administration, it's for the staff and the board. This has been talked about for a long time. Ever since I've been in Detroit, I've seen tremendous change at the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, but the conversations are happening now. We're in this room. Sphinx exists now, but we owe it to all the people who came before us, who started the conversations, and it was not a room of this size, to continue. So I too urge you to be creative, to not run from the issue, to really address it. And I am certain everyone in this room wants to do that, but it takes hard work and persistence. So I thank you for taking it back and working on it some more.
Persist. Clark?
I think the conversation has to get, in one sense, to a different level. I want to tell you a little story, but let me make my point. I think sometimes we think so often about the mechanics of music, the personal enjoyment of music, that we fail to see the transcendent importance of music. And I want to put it in context. Yesterday I was at breakfast where the President of the United States gave one of the most humble talks I've heard from almost any person. In the room were men and women from literally every continent, representing many parliaments from different countries. And he spoke with a humility, and when he finished, Andre Bocelli sang. And when he finished, here was the most powerful man in the world getting up from his seat to go over to Bocelli. But part of the reason that he did is that when Bocelli finished, he spoke to everyone there, and it was very moving to see because he moved from the microphone and something struck his spirit that he reached out to try to find the microphone and felt it and went back in front of it. And the people in the room come from lots of opposites, let's just put it that way. And Bocelli said, the two challenges facing our world are hubris and a lack of love reflected in people praying together. And the President of the United States, when Bocelli finishes, gets up and walks over to embrace him. That is the power of song. That is the depth of why any of this ought to matter. And if we think about it at a different level rather than the mechanics of it, I think these issues of these artifacts take care of themselves.
Excellent. Paul, final thoughts.
Beautifully said. I'm so glad you said that because it leads to my 2 points. My first is a question. What if we're trying to climb the wrong mountain? Does it really matter if we have 5 more people of color in the DSO? Or does it matter that every student in the Detroit public school system has the chance to sing, to play an instrument, to represent their heritage and their history? I would like both, but I don't want to lose sight that, yes, music education is gone from most of our schools. It's viewed as an extracurricular activity of those that can afford it, either by time or by location, and it's somehow marginalized in the corner rather than part of a well-rounded education that every person should have. So my question to ourselves is, you asked about the music education. 50 years ago, we had great music education, no more change in our orchestras. So that connection doesn't matter, but the life's journey matters. Music matters in and of itself. It's what you said. My closing point is I dream about a small D. I dream about a day when instead of having national signing days for our college sports teams, that we're actually proactively going out, pursuing people of talent, nominating them, getting them to unveil their choice of orchestra auditions or colleges or high schools based on their artistic talent. Wouldn't that be a great day? Yeah, you want to do that? How fun would it be to have musicians making videos of themselves, talking about, I'm going to take this audition, I'm advanced to the finals, all those things. I dream about a day when that kind of prevalence takes over rather than the next kid going to hit people with a football in their hands.
That's excellent. All right, 2 things. The first, I need all of your help so I get out of trouble with Sphinx. We're going to take a 5-minute break because I've got a lot of foundations that are coming up here next, and I'm scared of them, so please be back for them. And then more importantly, please join me in thanking everyone for this really great conversation. All right, we'll see you.